The dig at Ballytear on the Isle of Man in 1946 wasn't supposed to unearth a crime scene. They were excavating a Viking age burial. A high-status male warrior laid to rest with his sword and shield. But beneath him, in the cold, damp earth, lay something else. The skeleton of a woman, young, her skull cleaved open from above by a massive, single blow. Her bones were arranged in a way that defied a respectful burial. She had been thrown into the grave first, a final, macabre offering before her master's body was placed on top of her. For decades, this was interpreted as a straightforward case of ritual sacrifice. The slave, the ambot, following her owner into the afterlife. But recent forensic analysis of the bones, published in the Journal of Scandinavian Archaeology in 2019, tells a darker story. Isotope analysis revealed she wasn't local. She grew up hundreds of miles away, likely on the Scottish coast. Further examination of her vertebrae showed signs of chronic stress, the kind associated with hard, repetitive labor. This wasn't an honored servant. This was a captive. And the blow that killed her wasn't a clean, ritualistic execution. It was brutal, efficient butchery. Her death wasn't a sacrament. It was an act of disposal. The sagas speak of glory and gold, but they are silent on this. They don't describe the moment a person is stripped of their name, their family, their future, and turned into an object to be broken and discarded in a whole. The truth of the captive bride isn't in the epic poems. It's in the forensic evidence of a splintered skull, buried in the dark. You hear the term Viking bride and you think of shield maidens, of strong women forging alliances. This is a romantic myth, a modern fantasy projected onto the iron-hard reality of the 9th century. The Old Norse language had precise words for the women taken in raids, and none of them were bride. They were ambot, female thralls. Or they were frilla, a concubine, a status only marginally better than a field hand. They were property, acquired through violence and legally classified alongside livestock. What happened after the longships beached on a foreign shore and the monastery bells fell silent was not a courtship. It was a harvest. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, recounting the first raids in the late 700s, speaks of the Vikings seizing all the treasures and miserably slaughtering the inhabitants. But it also notes they carried people away into bondage. This wasn't an afterthought. It was a primary objective. The entire economic model of the Viking expansion relied on a constant supply of human beings. Silver could be spent once. Land could be farmed. But a captive woman was a multi-purpose asset. She was a source of labor, a producer of more laborers, and a commodity that could be sold for a high price in the sprawling slave markets that stretched from Dublin to the Caspian Sea. The Victory Feast was not the end of her ordeal. It was the beginning of a systematic process of dehumanization, codified in law and confirmed by the cold, hard evidence excavated from the earth. The captive bride wasn't a prize of war. She was the fuel for the war machine itself. To understand what happened to these women, you have to understand the geopolitical landscape of the 9th and 10th centuries. This wasn't chaotic, opportunistic raiding. It was a sophisticated international business enterprise. The primary trade hubs of the Viking world, places like Hedeby in modern-day Germany, Birka in Sweden, and especially Dublin in Ireland, were not just centers for timber and fur. They were Europe's largest human trafficking markets. After a successful raid on an English village or an Irish monastery, the captives were sorted. The men fit for fighting might be killed or enslaved for hard labor. The women entered a different, more terrifying calculus. They were marched to the coast and loaded onto ships. Their destination was often Dublin, which, under Norse control from 841 AD, became the nexus of the slave trade in the West. Irish annals lament the great sea-belched floods of foreigners who carried off thousands into bondage. From Dublin, these captives were shipped out across the known world. Some were sent north, to the new settlements in Iceland, where the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, lists countless Gaelic thralls by name, footnotes in the founding of a nation. Others were shipped east, across the North Sea to Hedeby, and from there down the river systems of Russia to the great markets of the Byzantine and Abbasid empires. Arab chroniclers like Ibn Fadlan described the tall, fair-skinned Sakaliba slaves sold in these markets, women who had begun their journey in chains, on the shores of the Irish Sea. This was the system, an industrial-scale network designed to turn human lives into silver dirhams and political power. The process of selection began the moment the fighting stopped, amid the smoke and ruin of a captured settlement. It was a cold, pragmatic assessment, devoid of emotion. Not all captives were deemed worthy of transport. The very old, the very young, or the seriously wounded were often killed on the spot. They were considered liabilities, unable to survive the brutal journey ahead. The ideal captive bride, or more accurately, thrall woman, fell within a specific age range, typically between 12 and 25. This was the nexus of peak fertility and physical resilience. The 10th century Persian geographer Ibn Rusta, describing the Rus Vikings, noted how they examined captives for their health and strength, much like a farmer inspects livestock. They would check teeth for signs of disease, feel the muscle tone of limbs, and assess what one chronicler called breeding signs. Those who passed this horrific inspection were marked, sometimes with a splash of red ochre on the forehead, sometimes with a temporary brand. This mark signified ownership. It separated the disposable from the valuable. It was the first step in erasing a person's identity and replacing it with a price tag. This selection process was rapid, often taking place in a matter of hours. The longships had to be ready to leave with the tide, to evade any local militias that might regroup. In that short window, a woman's entire world was dismantled. Her family was gone, her home was destroyed, and her future was now in the hands of men who saw her not as a human being, but as cargo. If you value this kind of evidence-first history, pulled from the stark records of the past, subscribe to The Sealed Room. What we are about to uncover goes deeper into the mechanics of this forgotten economy. The journey by sea was the next filter in this brutal system of natural selection. Viking longships, masterpieces of naval engineering, were not designed for human cargo. They were open to the elements, offering no shelter from the relentless North Atlantic wind, the freezing spray, and the violent storms. Captives were typically chained to the deck or the rowing benches. Excavations of sunken ships, like the Skulderev wrecks in Denmark, show how cramped the space was. There was no room to stand, barely enough to shift position. Iron rings and shackles, found in abundance at Viking port sites like Birka, confirm this practice. A 2012 experimental archaeology project by the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde attempted to replicate a North Sea crossing under these conditions. The volunteers, even well-fed and in modern clothing, suffered from exposure, dehydration, and circulation problems within 48 hours. For a malnourished captive in thin rags, the journey, which could last from several days to weeks depending on the weather, was a death sentence for many. They were given minimal rations, a little water, some hard bread or dried fish, just enough to keep them alive. Dehydration and starvation were used as tools of control. Weak captives could not fight back. They could not attempt to jump overboard. The sagas are silent on this, but the archaeological record is not. Mass graves found near coastal landing spots, like the one unearthed at Weymouth in England, contain the bodies of young men and women who likely perished during or immediately after such a journey. They were the transport losses, the cost of doing business, their bodies unceremoniously dumped before the valuable survivors were marched to market. The victory feast, so central to the Viking warrior ethos, was not a simple celebration. It was a crucial ritual for consolidating the raid's profits, both material and human. This feast rarely happened on the cramped, dangerous ships. It took place at the first secure location, a temporary island encampment, a fortified base, or upon returning to their home fjord. Here, the plunder was divided. Silver, weapons, and armor were distributed according to rank and deeds in battle. Then came the distribution of the women. This was not a chaotic free-for-all. It was a structured, hierarchical process designed to reinforce the warband's command structure and prevent internal conflict. The jarl or chieftain always had the first pick. His chosen woman was a symbol of his success and authority. After him came his chief lieutenants and ship captains. The remaining captives were then divided among the common warriors, often by casting lots, runes, or marked sticks drawn from a helmet. At this moment, a captive woman was formally and publicly assigned to her new master. She had no voice, no choice. Often, she didn't even speak the language of her captors. This public distribution was a legal act in the context of Norse customary law. It established ownership in front of witnesses. Any warrior who later interfered with another's captive would be guilty of theft, a serious offense that could be punished by outlawry or death. The feast that followed, with its heavy drinking and feasting on stolen livestock, was a celebration of this new order. For the warriors, it was a bonding ritual. For the captive women, it was the final confirmation of their new reality as property. Once assigned to a master, the captive woman's legal identity was erased. She ceased to exist as a person and became an object under the law. The surviving medieval Scandinavian law codes, such as the Icelandic Gragaz and the Norwegian Gulating law, are brutally clear on this point. A captive woman, an ambot, had no legal rights. She could not own property. She could not testify in a legal proceeding. She could not refuse her master's sexual demands. Any children she bore belonged to her master, not to her, and were born into servitude as thrall-born. The relationship between a master and his captive was not marriage in any sense recognized by Norse law. It was ownership. He could sell her, trade her, gamble her away, or even kill her with little to no legal consequence. The law codes did address violence against captives, but only through the lens of property rights. If another man assaulted or killed a captive, he wasn't charged with rape or murder. He was charged with damaging or destroying another man's property and had to pay the owner compensation, a fine known as wergild, but set at a fraction of the value for a free person. This legal framework is one of the most macabre parts of the entire system. It wasn't lawless chaos. It was legally sanctioned, systematic exploitation. The law was not a shield for the weak. It was a weapon for the powerful, designed to legitimize and regulate the profits of human trafficking. The cold, dispassionate language of these codes reveals a society that had fully integrated slavery into its legal and economic DNA, creating a permanent, heritable underclass built upon the foundation of violence and capture. For a long time, the stark descriptions in the law codes and annals were viewed by some as exaggeration, the propaganda of Christian monks. But in the last 50 years, archaeology has provided chilling, irrefutable proof. Excavations at major Viking Age settlements consistently reveal the physical reality of slavery. At the trading hub of Hedeby, archaeologists unearthed distinct living quarters: the large, central longhouse for the free family and smaller, windowless, sunken-featured huts on the periphery. Inside these huts, the finds are different. The pottery is cruder, the animal bones are from cheaper cuts of meat, and sometimes iron collars and shackles are found discarded in the corners. A 2017 osteoarchaeological study from Lund University analyzed skeletal remains from a Viking-era cemetery in Sigtuna, Sweden. By examining bone chemistry and stress markers, they could distinguish between the local free population and non-local thralls. The thralls, many of whom were women from the British Isles and Eastern Europe, showed clear signs of a life of hardship: higher rates of healed trauma, joint disease from excessive labor, and evidence of severe malnutrition during childhood, visible as harassed lines in their bones. This is the story the sagas don't tell. It's the story of aching backs, of gnawing hunger, of sleeping on a cold floor. It's the physical evidence of a society built on a brutal class divide, a divide so absolute that it was literally etched into the skeletons of its victims. The cold earth does not lie. The bones, excavated 1,000 years later, bear silent witness to the daily, grinding reality of being a captive bride. The children born from these forced unions entered a complex and cruel legal and social twilight zone. They were not considered part of their father's lineage. They were thrall-born, a status they inherited from their mother. According to the law codes, these children were the property of their mother's owner from birth. While they might not face the same daily hardships as a newly captured thrall, their lives were circumscribed by a thicket of legal and social restrictions. They could not inherit land or significant property from their free father. This was crucial in a society where land ownership was the bedrock of wealth and status. It ensured that the established families maintained their power, preventing the dilution of their estates. They were also barred from holding high office or acting as a key witness in serious legal disputes. Their word was legally worth less than that of a freeborn man. The sagas are filled with characters whose lives are shaped by this stigma. The insult of being called thrall-born was one of the most severe in the Norse world, often leading to bloodshed. While a path to freedom existed, it was difficult. A master could choose to formally free a thrall-born child, a process called leisingi, but this was an economic decision, not a moral one. A freedman still owed obligations to his former master's family. Full social acceptance might take generations. This system created a permanent, self-perpetuating underclass that provided a stable source of labor for Norse society. The captive bride's ordeal did not end with her. It was passed down into the blood, a legacy of bondage that shaped the lives of her children and her children's children. For those who value deep, documented history, consider supporting our work on the Sealed Room. By subscribing, you enable us to keep digging into these forgotten stories. Was there resistance? The records are sparse, written by the victors and rarely concerned with the perspective of the enslaved, but fragments of defiance flicker in the dark. The Icelandic Laxdæla saga tells the story of Melkorka, an Irish princess captured and made a concubine by a Norse chieftain. For years, she pretends to be mute, a silent protest and a way of protecting her identity. It is only when she secretly teaches her native Gaelic to her son that her noble origins are discovered. While the saga frames this romantically, the core of the story is one of profound psychological resistance. Most attempts at defiance were not so subtle, and they were almost always met with overwhelming force. Legal records mention punishments for defiant thralls, which ranged from whipping and branding to mutilation, like the cutting of Achilles' tendons to prevent running away. Outright violence was met with death. A fragment from an Icelandic legal text details the case of a thrall woman who killed her master with a seax, a small knife, while he slept. She was taken to the local thing, or assembly, where her execution was ordered. She was tied in a sack and drowned, a common punishment for those who upset the social order in the most extreme way. Archaeology occasionally provides macabre hints of these final, desperate struggles. The 2009 excavation of a mass grave of Vikings at Ridgeway Hill in Dorset, England, revealed one skeleton, a woman, with deep cut marks on her hands and forearms, classic defensive wounds. She had fought back against her executioners. She failed, but the marks on her bones are a testament to her final act of defiance, a silent scream preserved for a millennium. A woman captured in a raid on the coast of Northumbria did not necessarily end her days in Norway. The Viking trade network was a vast, interconnected web, and she was now a product to be moved to where the price was highest. Her physical appearance became a key factor in her fate. Arab merchants in the east, who traded extensively with the Rus Vikings via the Volga and Dnieper River routes, prized tall, fair-skinned, blonde women. Accounts from writers like al-Masudi describe these women being sold for exorbitant prices in the markets of Baghdad and Constantinople for the harems of wealthy caliphs and emirs. A captive with these features was more likely to endure the grueling, months-long river journey east. In contrast, Celtic women from Ireland and Scotland, often darker-haired, were more commonly sold within the Norse world itself. They were taken to the burgeoning settlements in Iceland and the Faroe Islands to become farm laborers and domestic servants. Isotope analysis confirms this stark reality. A 2021 study by the Max Planck Institute examined skeletons from Viking Age graves across Scandinavia. By analyzing strontium isotopes in tooth enamel which reflect the geology of where a person grew up, they proved that a significant percentage of the female population, especially in rural graves, were non-local, originating from the British Isles, the Baltic, and Slavic lands. This wasn't migration. This was forced relocation on a massive scale. A captive bride's face, her hair, the color of her eyes, these were no longer parts of her identity. They were commercial traits that would determine whether her final destination was a frozen farmstead in Iceland or a gilded cage in the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. Sometimes the line between slave and sacrifice blurred completely, and the captive bride's journey ended in a ritual of unimaginable terror. The most famous account comes from the Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan, who in 922 witnessed the ship funeral of a Rus chieftain on the Volga River. He describes how, after the chieftain's death, one of his slave girls volunteered to be sacrificed and buried with him. The process he documents is a macabre, 10-day ritual. The girl is dressed in fine clothes, feasted, and passed from tent to have sexual intercourse with the chieftain's chief warriors. They told her this was to honor her master. On the final day, she was led to the ship where her master's body lay. There, she was given an intoxicating drink, forced to sing, and then strangled with a cord by an old woman known as the Angel of Death, while other men stabbed her repeatedly with knives. Her body was then placed beside her master, and the ship was set ablaze. For a long time, scholars debated whether Ibn Fadlan's account was exaggerated, but archaeological discoveries like the Ballytere burial on the Isle of Man and other double burials where a richly adorned male is buried with a violently killed female suggest such practices were real. This was the ultimate expression of ownership. The captive woman, who was her master's property in life, was forced to become his property in death as well. Her life, her body, and her final, terrifying moments were consumed in a public display of power and pagan belief, a final, horrifying end to a journey that began in violence and servitude. The system was so efficient, so profitable, that it developed a momentum of its own. But what happened when foreign raids became too costly, or when defenses in places like England and France became too strong? The machine still needed to be fed, and the evidence suggests that when foreign sources dried up, the system turned inward. The Norse began to prey on their own. In the Viking Age trading town of Ribe in Denmark, a 2019 ground-penetrating radar survey revealed a large, previously unknown burial pit on the outskirts of the old market. Subsequent excavation uncovered a mass grave containing over 60 skeletons, predominantly female, all dating to the mid-9th century. They showed signs of malnutrition, and many had unhealed injuries consistent with violence. This looked like a typical slave burial pit. But the analysis of their grave goods, simple amber beads and clothing fragments, and a preliminary DNA study yielded a shocking result. Many of these women were genetically Scandinavian. They were not captives from Ireland or England. They were Danes, Swedes, or Norwegians. This was evidence of an internal slave trade. Perhaps they were debtors, sold into servitude. Perhaps they were victims of local power struggles, their families defeated by a rival chieftain. Or perhaps they were simply kidnapped by slavers operating within Scandinavia itself. This macabre discovery reframes the entire narrative. The horror of the captive bride was not just something Vikings inflicted on foreigners. It was a core part of their economy, a tool so powerful and so ruthless that, when necessary, it was deployed against their own people. The line between us and them could be erased by the simple, brutal logic of profit. Centuries later, when the sagas of Iceland were finally written down by Christian scholars looking back on their pagan past, this brutal reality was laundered. The raw, violent transaction of the captive bride was often repackaged into a story of romance and social mobility. In the sagas, the captured woman is no longer a terrified villager. She is an Irish princess, a woman of high birth whose status is temporarily obscured. Her captor is not a brutal warrior, but a noble hero who recognizes her inherent worth. Their union, which in reality was rape and subjugation, is portrayed as a faded romance. The children, who in the 9th century were legally semi-free at best, are elevated in the narrative to become the heroic founders of great Icelandic families. The story of Melkorka in Laxdæla Saga is the perfect example of this historical revisionism. Her story, and others like it, served a crucial purpose for the 13th century Icelandic chieftains who commissioned the sagas. It allowed them to acknowledge their Gaelic ancestry, which they knew was present in their bloodlines from the slave trade, without acknowledging the brutal truth of how it got there. It replaced a history of mass abduction and sexual violence with a more palatable narrative of noble, star-crossed lovers. The sagas are not a clear window into the Viking Age. They are a fractured mirror, reflecting a carefully curated version of the past. The true story of the captive bride is not in what the sagas say, but in the silences they keep, the horrors they consciously chose to write out of history. We return in the end to the cold earth of Ballytere, to the woman with the cleaved skull, buried without a name, without a marker, her existence reduced to a footnote in the burial of the man who owned and killed her. We now understand the vast, international system that brought her there. We see the cold logic of the selection process, the horrors of the sea journey, the ritualized humiliation of the victory feast, and the legal cage that stripped her of all humanity. We can trace the economic incentives and the social structures that made her suffering not just possible but profitable. But we will never know her name. We will never hear her story in her own words. She, and the tens of thousands of women like her, are the silent architects of the Viking Age. Their stolen labor built the farms of Iceland. Their sale price funded the ships that sailed to America. Their stolen lives were the currency that financed an empire of the sea. The heroic sagas and the glittering treasures in museums are only one half of the story. The other half is written in the forensic reports, in the isotope analysis of bones, and in the deviant burials of nameless women. It is a story of a systematic, macabre industry. The true legacy of the Viking victory feast isn't the heroic poetry it inspired. It is the chilling silence from 1,000 unmarked graves, a silence that, once you learn to listen for it, is deafening.